I really like to thank the organizers for this honor. I remember my first ISCHE conference. It was in 2008 at Rutgers University, New York. I was a PhD student, very nervous, of course, but I'm still today, to be honest. And I gave my talk in French. And now, 17 years later, we're in Lille, in France, and I've chosen to speak in English. And for this, I want to apologize to my French colleagues, Anne-Marie. We're here in large numbers, of course, and to fellow scholars from Latin language countries who might have found my French more comfortable. And I just give one reason for this linguistic shift. Many of the colleagues I've met through ISCHE and with whom I've worked since do not speak French. And I couldn't imagine speaking for almost 1 hour without them being able to follow me. In other words, rather than framing language choice as a global power issue, I prefer to see it right now as a way of nurturing past and future connections, creating new connections, because that's what, in the end, I really appreciate in our conferences. So this talk now, it's entitled Portrait of the Teacher as a Civil Servant, Portrait de l'enseignant en fonctionnaire. The relationship between the teachers and the state is a classic topic, a topic repeatedly visited by historians everywhere, I think. See Christopher Bishop, Teaching Britain, or Hilary Falb-Kalisman, Teachers as State Builders, a topic especially revisited in France. This has probably something to do with the specificity of our political tradition, our attachment to universal abstract rules, the long history of state and school centralization, surely. But it may also reflect the special links that tied history of education to the central administration itself in France. I think that some of you probably remember that the French correspondent to the ISCHE used to be not an association, but an office, the Service d'Histoire de l'Éducation, which was located within an administrative institution, Institut National de Recherche Pédagogique. And so, in a metaphoric sense, of course, French history of education has been partly written by the teaching state for the teaching state, with a steady focus on decision, education policy, and administration. Steady but not exclusive, of course. And since I was required by the organizers to seize this opportunity to give a glimpse into French historiography and not only on my work, okay, this topic was certainly a good one. But in the end, what brought me to this somehow were-not topic, and I'm sorry for this, it's definitely my attempt to grasp at some recent developments. So let me start with two memories. First, a conversation with my students. They were all future teachers or educators. And during this conversation, many of them expressed deep skepticism about the system. That word, vague, all-encompassing, which conveys a diffuse distrust of elites, government, politics, administration, and we know very well where all this could lead. And what I think today is this. Maybe their distrust reflected the paradoxical and dangerous success of what Timothy Mitchell called the state effect. That is, this illusion produced by mundane processes, such as regulations, laws, statistics, administrative routines, procedures, all these that create the illusion of this somehow distinct and coherent sphere set apart from society, economy, school, or education itself, a sphere my students do not feel they belong to, a sphere they even clearly rejected. And still, they were preparing to be fonctionnaires, so part of the system, weren't they? But what does that imply exactly, to be a fonctionnaire, a civil servant? And here comes a second memory. In 2010 in France, there was a public outcry led by philosophy teachers in secondary school, when a new test was added to the national competitive examination for secondary school teachers' recruitment. It was entitled Agir en fonctionnaire de l'État et de façon éthique et responsable, so act as a civil servant in an ethical and responsible way. Critics then saw it as a kind of moral test and tool for political control. 2 years later, following presidential elections, the test and the skill it assessed were renamed. Candidates would finally be expected not to act as fonctionnaires, but as agents du service public de l'éducation, agents of the public service of education. But whatever the name, over the past 10 years, the central administration has consistently worked to ensure that teachers are able to transmit the values of the Republic, that is, to secure the conformity of teachers' mind and behavior on politically sensitive issues such as the ban of religious symbol in schools. So please try to imagine, on one side, future teacher expressing distrust towards the system, and on the other, central authorities working to renew commitment to shared values, and me, in between, just wondering which audience I was addressing to while I was writing history of education. And so now here I am at the ISCHE with my somehow worn-out topic. One last introductive word. Reading my title, you may have wondered why I chose civil servant, fonctionnaire, and not public servant, agent public. Because in English, there is a clear distinction between both. A civil servant, a fonctionnaire, in the Weberian sense, is a kind of bureaucrat recruited through competitive exam, protected from political shifts, and part of the administrative core of the states. But a public servant, an agent public, is anyone working for the common good across health, education, and beyond. But this distinction that works well in English doesn't apply that well to the French case. For much of the 19th and 20th century, a fonctionnaire was someone paid directly by the state, and that included a growing number of teachers, though not all, even today. After decades of debate, it was only in 1946 that the fonctionnaire acquired a unified legal framework setting out the rights, duties, and career path of civil servants, including the majority of teachers at public schools. So the French teacher is not only at the service of the public, he or she is at the service of the state, this elusive entity I just mentioned before. And this has various implications. So in what follows today, I will explore these implications through 3 interconnected lenses applied to my past and present areas of research. The records first, sketching the civil servant through public records, power struggle from the public arena to the classroom, and finally bread and butter stories, because in the end, teachers are teaching for a living. Now let's begin. As befits a historian, I will of course begin with some reflection on the sources we and I use to document teachers' lives. The sources produced by administration itself. The more numerous these sources, the stronger the ties that bind the teachers to the states. The archetypal sources for many studies on teachers are the so-called dossiers de personnel or personal files. I'm sure that the content of these records will sound familiar to many of you beyond France, perhaps to all of you. You may know them as teacher record cards, personal files, Lehrerkartei, Expedientes de Maestros, and so on. These are the kind of documents that typically contain the teacher's name, date and place of birth, inspection reports, job appointments, and a variety of material related to the career, such as correspondence, administrative inquiries, inspection reports, and so forth. There is probably much in common between the French Dossier de carrière d'instituteur, primary school teacher record, held in the multiple departmental archives throughout the territory, and their counterparts in other countries. But right now, I want to focus on the records held in the National Archives at Pierrefitte-sur-Seine. Probably any French historian of education working on secondary school teachers, educators, school administrators, école normale, technical schools, or higher education will at some point find themselves exploring a well-known collection in the National Archives, in the French National Archive near Paris, la série F17 20001 à 27660, the dossier individuel de carrière, individual career files. This collection of records is probably the most concrete manifestation of the link between the nation-state and public education. They illustrate how education came to be embedded within the bureaucratic machinery of the modern French state. The dossier de carrière of the French administration have a complex and long-standing history. For example, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has preserved personal files dating back from the 18th century. In public education, the turning point came later. It coincided at the beginning of the 19th century with new guarantees granted to secondary school and faculty teachers following the creation of the Lycée in 1802 and the establishment of the Imperial University, Université Impériale, in 1806. Because following these rules, the fonctionnaires de l'université, at least those higher up in the hierarchy, were granted the right to a pension, and naturally, calculating pensions required documenting the career. As in other branches of the central administration, the creation of career files was thus probably linked to the introduction of pension entitlements. The scope of this collection, its early establishment, its structural parallel with other civil servant archives, and the numerous instruments created to support research on this topic may help explain some specific features of French historiography, and chief among them is the success of prosopography or collective biographies, a method that remains central to the social history of various subgroups of civil servants, from scholars to prefects to post officers, a method also dear to French historians of education. And here there are so many colleagues I could quote, but I would just name Jean-François Condette, Amandine Charvet, and there are so many other, Christophe Charles, well, whatever. Dropping a name is just too hard in this exercise. But when we delve into official files to trace the training, the social background, the promotion, the career of teachers, I really wonder to what extent we are unknowingly endorsing the very biographical regime, a formula coined by Jean-Luc Chappé, a biographical regime devised by the state itself. In other words, we're recounting lives of teachers in the manner it prescribed or wished them to appear. And in the end, I think that's exactly what I did when I traced the traditional cursus honorum of the general inspectors for French language and literature teachers that were working in the 40s and the 50s. In my research through their career files, I followed these agrégés de lettres, so maybe here a useful explanation. Agrégé, in France, epitomize academic elitism. For more than 2 centuries now, the agrégation has been a prestigious national competitive exam that granted access to teaching position in secondary schools. So, obviously, the general inspectors were former agrégés, and in French literature and language teaching, agrégés de lettres. And I followed these agrégés de lettres, born around the beginning of the 20th century, as they moved from provincial schools to elite preparatory classics at top Parisian lycées, such as Henri IV, Louis le Grand. And so I could describe the way they climbed each rung of the professional ladder thanks to glowing inspection records. And their records seem to reflect a perfect meritocratic order in which the best teachers were recognized and promoted accordingly to their merits. And how could I resist chronicling the power of this meritocratic logic over individual trajectory, logic that drain all talents to the capital, Paris? And indeed, I found myself marveling at the exceptional case of Aristide Bocconiano, who, and it's a rare exception in that period, leapt directly from Montpellier to the inspectorate without ever having served at Henri IV or Louis le Grand. And now living in Montpellier, I think I know why he didn't want to go to Louis le Grand or Henri IV in Paris. That's another story. But obviously, as you know, and as many of you have experienced, the files do not only register the legal, rational order of bureaucracy and meritocracy. Please consider this example from 1932. Fayolle, a radical socialist member of parliament from the Haute-Loire, filled out a pre-printed, and you see it's pre-printed, the first sentence here, it's printed, and it's « J'ai l'honneur de vous recommander », so it's just common practice by them. And he fills out this pre-printed recommendation form for Georges Bellet, which is one of these agrégés de lettres, who requested his transfer from the Lycée High School of Chartres to the department of the Seine, that is Paris, a move that would have implied a promotion. And the dossier de carrière of the Third Republic, the teachers' records, are full of such political intervention. These were officially recorded, as we notice here, and scrupulously annotated by the administration. The annotations are here over on the left. And what story does that tell us? Certainly not the triumph of meritocratic principles, for sure, but another face of the Republic, a republic of favor and complaints, of political patronage, or maybe just the crutches of a system that was already too big to manage geographical mutations properly, and probably both. Though this cornucopia of teacher records remains a rich resource for historians, but only for those who work in teachers who retired before the 1980s. After that, the dramatic expansion of the state and within it of the school system throughout the 20th century has just destabilized the traditional archival practices of personal files. Just two figures. There were around 6,000 public secondary school teachers in lycée and collège around 1900. Now in 2025, 125 years later, there are more than 370,000. So obviously, selection and sampling of the dossier de carrière, which was once a task for researchers crafting their own project, prosopographies, now this sampling occurs at the archival stage itself. And I cannot help thinking that this huge process of elimination symbolized something more than technical constraints. Something I just can't name exactly, but maybe the weakening of the personal bond between the state and its servants. Hopefully for the historian, happily. Another tool, one equally emblematic of the state creep in school, has already taken over, statistics. Of course, you will tell me school statistics date back to the 19th century, when public education began to rise. And Jean-Noël Luc in France has described the development of official statistics in primary schools from early attempts in the late 18th century to routinization in the 1830s. But these early efforts mainly focused on schools and pupils, and for a long time, statistical data and teachers remained scarcer. They increased significantly during the second half of the 20th century for two main reasons. First, due to the expansion of public statistical services. In France, the National Statistical Institute created dedicated branches within each ministry, and by the 60s, the production of educational statistics had grown considerably. Second driver, there is the introduction of computer-based management system which made it possible to extract statistical data with far greater scope and precision, without placing additional administrative burdens on schools. And so, just one last step of this document. So, in a way, farewell to the biographical regime of the personal files and welcome to the data-driven understanding of the past. While I was working on my PhD, I spent many hours counting and categorizing teachers of French language and literature in the second half of the 20th century using statistics produced by the ministry, such as those I've just shown to you. These allowed me to divide teachers by gender, qualification, agrégé, certifié, auxiliaire, professeur d'enseignement général des collèges, and specialization, lettres classiques or lettres modernes. And this process, huge process, taught me a few lessons about the problematic transparency of statistics. At the time, I was studying the intense debates of the 40s and 50s over the emergence of a modern track for French literature teachers, a modern track, one that did not include Latin. And traditionally, French teachers in secondary schools were classically trained, mastering Latin and Greek. And the ideal model was, of course, the agrégé de lettres I already mentioned. Yet, many teachers in secondary schools came from different backgrounds. Some had no training in Latin at all, having come through technical or upper primary schools. Others, especially women, had training in Latin, but not in Greek. And this was quite common among women, since classical languages were introduced progressively into girls' secondary school during the interwar years. And so, a variety of actors came together to defend and promote the continued presence of these modern literary profiles within the teaching profession. The debates were heated, but official statistics, as you see here, remained surprisingly and ironically ecumenical. Until 1971, they made no distinction between lettres classiques, a teacher with classical training, and who had to teach French but also Latin and Greek, and lettres modernes, teachers with a modern training and who could only teach French. They all were labeled professeurs de lettres, as you can see here, which was really a nightmare for me, who was trying to study the teachers and trying to describe what they really know and what they were doing in the classrooms. Through statistics, I also sought to uncover the subcultures shaping the teaching of French language and literature in secondary school. My hope was the following, was thus: I hope to classify teachers according to their corps, which category in administrative language, which theoretically reflected their academic training, the mode of entry into the teaching profession, be it the CAPES, another competitive exam, or the agrégation. But at that time, due to recruitment crisis, the category of certifié included many teachers who had entered through exceptional pathway, and competitive examination were not the sole or even the main route. And so all these official figures of certifié and agrégé, which I patiently recounted in all these tables, they revealed something about salaries, about careers, but very little about training, academic capital, or alignment with ministerial expectations. Not to mention the teachers of the private sector, in which there were almost no data. And thus I experienced, and I did the same experience many times then, that state statistics always create the illusion of uniformity, standardization, control, an illusion we should of course question, just like the biographical regime that structures our dossier de carrière. And so, while I was living off state archives to document the history of teachers, I've come to feel like a kind of parasite exploiting the very flows of the organism from which I draw my raw material, which is a moral issue for me. Behind this elusive subdivision between lettres classiques and lettres modernes I just mentioned, there were, of course, power issues, with groups confronting each other. Who should be entitled to govern the discipline? Where shall the power lay? The administration, the government, experts, the teachers, and if so, which ones, classic, moderns? Again, this issue of power, authority, and autonomy in education is a classical topic in many historiographies. It resonates in curriculum history, think of Ivor Goodson, in the history of teacher professionalization like Antonio Novoa, and the study of teacher unionization, and there are so many names like Jeffrey and so on. But in the French case, the status of fonctionnaire, civil servants, carries specific implications that affect the form of collective organization as well as pedagogy and politics, and this is what I want to explain right now. And first, the state and the teacher as a professional body. My purpose when I started my PhD, a long time ago, was initially to explain the decision-making process regarding the French language and literature curricula in secondary schools. I especially wanted to know if the teachers had a voice, and how did that work? To answer the question, I had to navigate between rules that were formally in force, rules that were outdated but still present in the background, and informal practices. That's why I had to disentangle these multiple layers, which I will try to do for you right now with something very schematic, and I apologize to my French colleagues, but this may help. First, l'Université impériale. Established by Napoleon, the Université impériale was, on the paper, a teaching corporation composed of civil servants with a monopoly over education in the empire. It had little to do with modern universities, rather it was modeled on the medieval corporation formed by the University of Paris, so really imagine a corporation, with as its head a grand maître, along with the Conseil de l'Université, University Council, whose members were appointed by political power. They oversaw disciplinary matters and educational policies. And why this structure echoed the Grand Maître, Conseil, echoed the autonomy of medieval corporation, the clear intent and the avowed intent was submission to political power. That's the first layer, and quite often summoned as the idea of a medieval corporation was still acting in the period I was studying. The second layer I had to disentangle was coincide with the consolidation of the Republican regime, a patriarchal, colonialist, and socially conservative one for sure, yet a republic nonetheless. And the republic proclaimed the rule of law, extended parliamentary power, and implemented many civil liberties. And this political ideal extended to education governance. At that time, teachers were to be elected to the Conseil supérieur de l'instruction publique, and their delegates formed the majority. This reorganization helped reject the influence of the church outside of school matters. But it was also a new form of consultative administration, a recognition of teachers' professional expertise as they had a word. At least the professional expertise of the male agrégé of secondary schools. At first, there were no delegates from the New Girl Public Secondary School, nor for the primary school teachers. It came later. So for each subject matter, the delegate of the agrégé was the legitimate voice. He embodied an authority based on expertise and specialization. Yet even as the legitimacy and pedagogical issue was acknowledged, teachers, like all fonctionnaires, were prohibited from forming unions, rights granted to other workers in 1884. After all, they were part of the state, so how could they organize against it? That was the issue. Of course, this prohibition did not last long, and teachers, and primary school teachers first, formed amicales, friendly societies, informal unions, and by 1924, the unions were tolerated, if not legally recognized. These changes prepared the third stage that started after World War II, that of the social republic, which forms my third layer. So following World War II, under a progressive coalition that included communists, there was a comprehensive Statut Général des Fonctionnaires, 1946, which guaranteed career progression, pensions, and reinforced the principle of merit-based recruitment via competitive examinations. And this for all fonctionnaires, including the teachers. This reform had far-reaching consequences. Teachers' unions, as other civil servant unions, were now legal and recognized as central to the functioning of the social republic. This was a time for paritarism or co-decision between unions and the administration, which became a standard across all civil service categories. For teachers, this reshaped the principle of representation. Unions became the principal legitimate interlocutors in negotiations with the states. There was a sort of institutional asymmetry which gave unions privileged access to teachers' representation within the elected councils, to audience of the politics and of the central administrations. It also gave them some resources in terms of funding and human resources, and in contrast, other associations, such as this one, for the classic teachers, subject associations, but also pedagogical associations, such as the Cahier Pédagogique or ISCHE or Freinet movements, they all struggled to gain or preserve officious recognition and material support. The victories were often partial and precarious. This asymmetry was, of course, reflected in historiography. For a long time, there has been a stark imbalance between the abundant literature on teacher unions and the more scarcer research on other forms of activism, teacher activism, which were always more precarious and contingent, due also to these state effects. French social historians that studied teacher organizations were primarily influenced by the framework offered by Social History of Labor Movement, and that probably explained this discrepancy. Still, as many of us noticed, in math, history, French, etc., these associations, this subject association, for example, played a role. They tried to build their legitimacy and their representativeness, and yet they were also partially, officiously embedded in the state. I just give one example. The Association Française des Professeurs de Français, the other association for French literature and language teacher, created in 1967. At the beginning, she was hosted by the Centre International d'Études Pédagogiques, Sèvres, which provided workspace, funding, integration into networks of international pedagogical exchange, especially with Quebec. So all sort of resources drain indirectly from the states, which show that this apparent distance between the states and this other sort of association could be, in a way, be overcome. Sorry. I could go on with this story, pointing to new layers that have accumulated since the 1980s, the rise of global governance, the growing role of researchers as government advisors, decentralization, and each new layer has made the rule of the games more complex, without ever fully replacing the models inherited from the past, which are still acting, at least in our imagination. The point I want to underscore here is this irritating difficulty. If you don't know the formal legal rules, their history, their stratification, then you just can't describe how conflicts about teaching, content, methods, exam, and so on are regulated, called the rules have a role. But if you think the rule apply without bending, then you're just missing the point, at least as regards the decision process. But in the end, do official state decisions really matter in the classroom? Here, I must confess, I doubt civil servant status makes any practical difference. Yes, formally, teachers in France are inserted into a state hierarchy. As civil servants, they must comply with rules regarding curriculum and methods, and they should not criticize them. At least, that's what a former police officer told me while she was retraining to be a teacher. And those who know me can well imagine the look on my face when she told me that we just couldn't criticize the curricula. But, of course, teaching is not police, and things are different. Professional hierarchy is not inherent to the job. It is a historical development consequent of the state's growing control over schooling. That is a well-known story. In the 19th century, the creation of a state inspectorate transferred oversight from local figures, the mayors, the priests, parents, to professional supervisors. And in that sense, it implied a rise in teachers' autonomy and status as much as submission to the state. Still, at that time, the official aim of the Université impériale was uniformité des méthodes, at least in male secondary schools, because there was the real stakes for public authority. So the same thing everywhere, same methods, same contents. It's hard to tell to what extent this was ever achieved. One thing is certain, in the 1970s, there was no such uniformity as regards French literature and language teaching in the French secondary school classrooms. This was one of the conclusions I drew from my inquiries, and this was somehow distressing for the young researcher I was then. Because on the one hand, I followed through the archives the subject associations, teacher unions, activists of all sorts, scholars in linguistic and comparative literature. They were all discussing what that meant, democratizing secondary education, what it required in terms of contents and methods in language and literature teaching. And they were all trying to weigh on official decisions, be it curricular or national exam. And on the other hand, I tried to understand if and how this decision would make a difference in the classroom, if they were to be translated. And the answer was, well, probably very little. Indeed, in the second half of the 20th century, the secondary school expansion had disintegrated several mechanisms of national coherence. A few examples. 1968, university autonomy had ended national controls on the diploma that led to teaching positions. Cohorts of new teachers had entered the profession with little or no selection. And finally, the inspectors were overwhelmed by the growing number of teachers, and they were also outshone by brilliant scholars at the universities such as Bourdieu, Barthes, Derrida. And so these inspectors, they just had lost their prestige. Let's take an example. Marie-France, a woman, upper class, with classical training. She had succeeded at the Agrégation de Lettres in 1964, but still, she was attracted to new methods in literature teaching, based, for example, on the Nouvelle Critique, Barthes, say, Jeunette, Todorov, for those who know. And with colleagues, she promoted these new methods of reading through various groups, activist groups, first a small informal, Enseignement 70, and then one of the subject associations, the Association Française des Enseignants de Français, I already mentioned. And so she worked with high school students on fairy tales, on journal articles. She discussed new interpretation based on structuralist analysis and narratology. And when I interviewed her, she described constant battles with the General Inspectorate, which tried and failed to control her practices and to bring her back to the tradition and heritage, that is, history of literature and the classics of the 17th century. She consistently refused to show any deference to this all-male incarnation of state authority, but had better relationships with the new category of inspecteurs pédagogiques régionaux, who were more attuned to new students' needs. As she noticed, ironically, the institution still had to rely on her to mentor new teachers, older colleagues, more traditional, those she dismissed as oiseaux empaillés, I could translate like living fossils, I don't know. And these older colleagues, they just refused to do it, to train new teachers, and in her opinion, they would have been unable to do it. So these micro-battles of the everyday led to real divergences in goals, contents, and teaching method, teaching styles by the early 1980s. The case of French language and literature teaching at that time may have been extreme, but it was certainly not exceptional. While decision-making has remained centralized in France as regards education and pedagogy, the means to ensure implementation across the entire territory have remained minimal, especially when compared to the accumulation of ambitions, goals, and major policy direction. To conclude in that aspect, it seems to me that the 2005 legal recognition of the liberté pédagogique, merely codified, was at long been the practice in French school culture. Political control, of course, is another story. Over the last 2 centuries, there are some persistent patterns in France that we would observe in many countries. Teachers tend to lean left and often hold radical views, which put them at odds with political majority. Given their influence in youth, they're subject to heightened scrutiny. Still, they benefited indirectly from the rise of modern bureaucracy and the guarantees that went with it, that is, a legally framed growing autonomy from political power, and in liberal democracies such as France, this meant a distinction between civil servants' rights as citizens, freedom of opinion and expression, and their duties, political neutrality at work. Since the 1950s, the legal framework is thus clear for the civil servant, at least on the paper. Political freedom as a citizen and strict neutrality when they're performing their duties, and especially within the classroom. However, the period following the events of 1968 saw a wide array of affairs that brought public attention to the public engagement of teachers. And today, I still wonder at the right way to narrate this story that happened around 1968, 1973, but let's try. First, a radical teacher in a technical lycée uses Gaston Lagaffe comics to raise class consciousness among his students. He refuses inspection and is sanctioned. His story continues in a left-wing terrorist group. Second, a middle school teacher uses Freinet texte libre, writing without an imposed topic. And one day, a student submits a text mixing teen sexual fantasy with biology lessons. Of course, it causes a scandal and raises the opposition of local and national Gaullists. Of course, the method itself was seen as a risk of cultural revolution. All these cases and others involve in various proportions moral panic, pedagogical debate, hierarchical tensions, tacit political control, and overt subversion. And I must say that 20 years ago, I saw them as a kind of folklore from the années 68, and sometimes I smile at these revolutionaries who 3 decades later had become peaceful specialists of didactics, holding comfortable positions in the universities. Nowadays, I must say, as democracy seems so fragile, I'm much more sensitive to this past polyphony of voices that tried to draw the line between pedagogy and politics, to all these battles that were carried out through media and pamphlets mobilizing unions, inspectors, sometimes police officers, and also judges. Ultimately, I must say, inspectors and judges alike avoided rigid enforcement. The best tribute to this benignity appeared in this pamphlet published against inspection. Non à l'inspection, where they say that so long as formal deference to the principle of inspection was maintained, the risk endured for progressive political views expressed in the classroom was rather low. And this brings me, and I'm late, I'm sorry, to my last part, bread and butter stories, teaching for a living. Because in the 60s, auxiliaries were far more vulnerable, and many of them lost their job due to this repression campaign. For the French teacher, being part of the fonctionnaires had very concrete material consequences, especially after World War II. It meant a robust set of guarantees shared across the civil service, but it also linked teachers' financial condition directly to the fiscal health of the nation states, which is not very good. If we look at the financial relationship between the state and teachers, pensions came first with the creation of the university. In the first half of the 19th century, pension schemes were introduced for various categories of teachers and later on integrated within one single system common to all French civil servants as early as 1853. The provision of the pension was tied to the idea that teachers were expected to devote their entire careers to the service of the state, and that the state, in turn, had the duty to provide for their old age. With insight, we may consider that civil servants were just at the forefront of a broader trend, that is, a gradual extension of retirement security to the entire population through the socialization of resources to protect against the risks of aging. There is a second major component of this financial link, and of course, it's the salary, in French, les traitements, which is the term for civil service. At first, in the 19th century, the state only provided top-ups to guarantee a minimum level of pay, and only later it took full responsibility for various categories of teachers' remuneration. The transfer of salaries to the state often meant, at least initially, better wages, and sometimes even salvation from precarious situations. That was the rationale behind, for example, the 1889 decision to transfer the payment of primary school teachers from municipalities to the states, because their salaries were too low and it was too hard for the municipality to raise them. And again, in 1959, the decision to publicly fund private schools was also made to guarantee a minimum level of subsistence to private school teachers. And still, private school teachers are not formally civil servants, which is not a legal quirk. Tracking the evolution of teachers' salaries has become a classic exercise in French social history of education, as well as in French sociology. And of course, you'll have the same in other countries. The question behind is usually, where do these put teachers in society, the amount of the salary? As if salaries reflected a rational assessment of the value of education, which I doubt very much. Indeed, the main driver of the history of teachers' salary is a broader story in France of civil service remuneration and the slow clarification of its formal principles, equal pay for equal qualifications and equal function, a key issue especially for women, but also the right to a career. For the teacher, the standardization and coordination of salaries was initially built within the Ministry of Public Instruction, with hierarchy between the various categories of teacher based on diploma, and a progression that reflected mainly the length of the service. Teachers' salary was then progressively integrated into a general framework common to all civil service salaries. It started in the interwar period, but here, the 1948 decree fixing the system of remuneration for all civil servants, and you have hundreds and hundreds of pages describing what you see here. That is a system that allows the state to compare and classify the salaries for all civil service. On the right, the teachers. Being integrated within this global civil service pay system provided guarantees in terms of income. It was, especially after the Second World War, a buffer against drastic salary cuts. And also until the middle of the 1980s, but not anymore, it was a guarantee in terms of purchasing power when there was inflation. But being integrated into the complex system of civil service pay system also came with drawbacks. Expressions such as contagion risk, parrot scale, index whirlwind became recurrent objections from the Ministry of Finance whenever teacher demanded raises, pay raises. There was the constant fear that any concession granted to one category of civil servant would be claimed by others, potentially causing the overall cost of public sector personnel to spiral out of control. Consequently, significant revaluation of teacher pay occur only when there is a lack of candidates for teaching positions, be it in 1961, 1988, or more recently, 2022. And for almost 40 years now, public sector pay, and not only teacher pay, has been strictly constrained, first by limited fiscal capacity, and second by the growing administrative capacity to manage and control this complex machinery of public sector remuneration. And this is the history underlying today's discouragement, this sense of stagnation expressed among French teachers and future teachers. But the amount of money is just one aspect of this material link. Becoming a teacher has often been a pathway out of material uncertainty. And here I would like to present two different types of stories. First, stories of social promotion. Since the late 19th century, the expansion of the state has opened access to tertiary employment and job security, particularly in regions lacking economic opportunities. This was specifically the case for teaching positions. There are a lot of teachers coming, for example, from Brittany. As a result, the French history of education, as other national histories of education, are filled with stories of teachers coming from farming backgrounds, supported by merit-based scholarship, des boursiers méritants, and rising across generations. First generation a peasant, second a primary school teacher, the third a secondary school teachers, and sometimes the first a university professor or higher-ranking civil servant. So if we think of school as a social elevator, an ascenseur social, which is the vocabulary we use in France, the clearest example of this function is the way school gave access to the teaching profession itself. With fluctuation, this elevator has been regularly fueled by the state by special financial support for those preparing to become primary and secondary school teachers. These pre-recruitment programs played a crucial role, especially given that in France, general support for students has long been insufficient. Higher education is still largely at one's own expense. Scholarship and loans remain underdeveloped. Thus, again, aiming for a civil service career, and especially in teaching, was one of the few reliable paths to funded higher education, for example, in the 1960s. But social promotion is just one side of the story. Job security is the other. And this brings us to the issue of contract teacher, the wretched counterpart of tenured teacher, a figure that constantly challenges the very principle of the civil service fixed in 1946, namely that public positions should be held by civil servants recruited through competitive examination. I could draw examples from various contexts, but I will once again focus on the 60s and 70s I've crisscrossed in my research. Contract teachers were essential in the 60s, when rapid school expansion meant there weren't enough qualified teachers. But by the 1970s, the context has shifted. The vacancies were filled, Competitive exam attracted many applicants, and yet hundreds of young auxiliaries, contract teachers, were struggling to find stable employment and fought for tenure, titularisation. Often these were not the top students. Many had failed the competitive exam or never attempted them. Yet they were there, year after year, filling in for vacancies, ensuring that every classroom had a teacher on the first day of school. And this created tension for both the government and the teacher unions. Granting tenure without passing a competitive exam would breach civil service rules. Yet, dismissing these teachers when they were not needed anymore led to personal tragedy, like the suicide of René Boudouresque, an auxiliary teacher not reappointed at the start of the 1976 school year. This context, with rising unemployment, placed huge pressure on the government, left and right, to create more permanent teaching positions, not primarily for pedagogical reasons, but to provide financial and social security to the teachers. Be it through social promotion or job security, access to teaching position has thus been one of the key arenas where expectations toward a providential state have crystallized, a state that governs destinies, uplifts, and protects. No need to say that these expectations sustain the illusion of an all-powerful state entity, while charging the education budget with expenditures that were primarily social in nature, not pedagogic. But precisely, and this will be my last point, the growing financial implication of teachers' remuneration and pension for state finance have had far-reaching consequences on education policies. Indeed, the rising cost of education has transformed the central administration and its culture. As financial consideration grew in importance, so did the role of generalist administrators within the Ministry of Education, administrators that were trained at the prestigious École Nationale d'Administration, the ENA, created in 1945. Of course, these administrators were better equipped to manage huge budgets and organizational complexity. But the rise came at the expense of educators' influence over policy. This shift has produced a no familiar outcome, also seen in other countries, a blurring of the line between state reform and educational reform. Everywhere since the 1970s, school failures, everywhere, not everywhere, but in many countries, school failures were increasingly interpreted as symptoms of the inefficiency of public action as a whole. As a result, education policy has often borrowed from the broader toolkit of public sector management, applying performance metrics and efficiency models to school to ensure that public money was well spent. And here again, we may observe how French teachers' history offers a declination of French civil service history. Indeed, political scientists such as Philippe Peuzès have demonstrated that French civil servants at all levels within the central administration, but also intermediate civil servants, have often efficiently resisted the more radical reforms seen elsewhere. While the vocabulary of neoliberalism, of new public management, of state reform is present in France, its actual implementation has remained modest in schools as in other areas. No widespread teaching to the test in France, no linking of salaries to student results, almost no marketization or school competition. So it's been so far a timid version of neoliberalism, whatever the place taken by this term in the analysis of French education policies. And here I think that the size, the coherence, the interdependence of a centralized state system has long acted as a strong protection of past rule and guarantees, limiting the amplitude of changes as compared to other countries, be it Sweden or the United States. To conclude, I began this talk by sharing my unease, caught on the one hand between future teachers expressing distrust, deep distrust towards the system, and on the other, central authorities striving to renew a shared commitment to common values. The only response I've found so far is the one I've just tried to illustrate here: to embrace complexity and nuance, to give the law, the rule of law, its rightful place, while at the same time exposing its limits, the constant temptation to bend or circumvent it above, but also recognizing the generous and necessary abundance of informal practices below but also above. I try also to acknowledge the high expectation fueled by the massive socialization of resources, this huge amount of public money, which is the legacy of the 20th century, while also highlighting the complexity of public management as a national scale, its technical, financial, and political limits. For me, making this complexity intelligible and audible in the public sphere is my way of challenging the illusion of state omnipotence, of unveiling the state effects for what it is, an illusion, and thus creating space for what we share beyond and before the state, because after all, there was knowledge to cultivate, children to educate, and teachers to guide them long before modern states came into being. Thank you for your attention.